At 4:15 on December 24, 1944, Oberleutnant Fritz Vincken locked the door of his small hunting lodge in the Hürtgen Forest and began the long walk back to his artillery battery positioned 12 kilometers away. He would not return for 3 days. His wife Elisabeth and their 12-year-old son Hermann would spend Christmas alone in the dense woods along the German-Belgian border, where American and German forces had been killing each other at a rate of 400 men per day for the past 3 months. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. One room downstairs. A loft above. No electricity. No running water. A wood stove for heat. Elisabeth had come here in early November when Allied bombers made their apartment in Aachen uninhabitable. The apartment had survived 2 years of air raids. The third raid destroyed it completely. Everything they owned burned. Everything except what they could carry. Hermann remembered packing a single suitcase. His mother chose warm clothes and photographs. His father wasn't there to help. He was with his artillery unit somewhere near Monschau, firing shells at American positions. They hadn't seen him in 6 weeks. The hunting lodge belonged to a friend of Fritz's who had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. The friend's widow gave Elisabeth the key and told her the cabin was hers as long as she needed it. The forest was dangerous. Wehrmacht units held positions on the German side of the border. American forces had pushed into the Belgian side after months of brutal fighting. The front line shifted daily, sometimes hourly. Artillery fire could be heard constantly, especially at night. Elisabeth kept Hermann inside after dark. They burned small fires so the smoke wouldn't attract attention. They ate sparingly because food was scarce. Hermann knew his father was fighting somewhere in these woods. He knew American soldiers were trying to kill him. He knew German soldiers were trying to kill Americans. He understood that this was war and that people died in war. What he didn't understand was why his mother seemed so calm. She cooked meals on the wood stove. She read books by candlelight. She sang Christmas songs even though there was no Christmas tree and no presents and no reason to celebrate anything. On Christmas Eve afternoon she was preparing what food they had for dinner. Potatoes. A small piece of smoked pork she'd been saving. Some bread. Hermann was bringing in firewood when he heard her gasp. He looked up. 3 men were standing at the edge of the clearing. They weren't German soldiers. Elisabeth saw them at the same time. American soldiers. 3 of them. One was being supported by the other 2. Even from a distance she could see the blood. The man in the middle could barely walk. His uniform was torn. His face was pale. The 2 men supporting him looked exhausted. All 3 were armed. Hermann dropped the firewood and moved toward the door. His mother caught his arm. She didn't speak. She watched the Americans approach slowly. They stopped 20 meters from the cabin. The healthier 2 looked around the clearing, checking for threats. Checking for German soldiers. One of them called out something in English. Elisabeth didn't understand the words. She understood the desperation. The man in the middle collapsed. His legs gave out and the 2 soldiers lowered him to the snow. One of them looked at Elisabeth and held up his hands. Empty hands. No weapon visible. He gestured toward his wounded companion. Made a pleading gesture. Elisabeth looked at the man in the snow. Blood was seeping through his uniform near his abdomen. The snow around him was turning red. She looked at her son. Hermann was 12 years old and had lived through 4 years of war. He had seen dead bodies in the streets of Aachen after air raids. He had watched buildings collapse. He had carried buckets of water to help put out fires. He wasn't a child anymore. Not really. She opened the door and gestured for the Americans to bring the wounded man inside. The 2 healthy soldiers looked at each other. One of them picked up a rifle. The other helped the wounded man stand. They moved toward the cabin slowly, carefully, expecting a trap, expecting German soldiers to emerge from the trees. No one emerged. Elisabeth held the door open and stepped aside as they carried their companion through. The heat from the wood stove hit them immediately. All 3 Americans had been in the cold for days. Their uniforms were frozen stiff in places. Their faces were weathered and raw from wind. The wounded man was barely conscious. The other 2 lowered him onto the floor near the stove. One of them started removing the injured man's jacket. Blood-soaked fabric stuck to the wound. The soldier worked carefully, peeling the uniform away. The wound was in the lower right abdomen. Still bleeding. Elisabeth knelt beside them. She had basic medical training from her time in the Bund-Deutscher Madel before the war. She'd worked in a hospital in Aachen for 6 months during the early days of the fighting. She knew how to clean wounds and apply dressings. She knew this man needed more help than she could provide. She knew he would die without proper medical care. But proper medical care was impossible. The nearest German field hospital was kilometers away through active combat zones. The nearest American medical unit was equally unreachable. This man was dying here or surviving here. There was no third option. She went to her small supply of medical items. Bandages, iodine, a bottle of schnapps for sterilization, a needle and thread for suturing. Not enough, never enough, but what she had. She returned to the wounded American and began cleaning the wound. The soldier flinched and groaned. One of his companions held his shoulders. The other spoke to him in English, reassuring words that Elisabeth couldn't understand but could interpret from the tone. Hermann stood in the corner watching. His mother was helping American soldiers. Soldiers who were trying to kill his father. Soldiers who had bombed their home. Soldiers who were the enemy. He looked at the two healthy Americans. They were watching his mother work. Their faces showed exhaustion and fear and something else. Hope maybe. Or just the absence of despair. Elisabeth finished cleaning the wound and began suturing it closed. The American soldier passed out halfway through. She worked quickly. Her hands were steady. Outside, darkness was falling. The forest was growing quiet. Artillery fire had stopped temporarily. Christmas Eve ceasefire maybe. Or just a pause before the next barrage. When she finished suturing, she applied iodine and wrapped clean bandages around the man's torso. He was unconscious but breathing steadily. Better than before. Still critical. Still in danger. The two healthy Americans looked at each other and then at Elisabeth. One of them reached into his pack and pulled out a wool blanket. He covered his wounded companion carefully. The other soldier stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. Checking for threats. Checking for salvation. Finding neither. Elisabeth stood and gestured toward the small table. She had set places for two. Herself and Hermann. Now she set three more. The Americans understood. One of them shook his head and gestured toward the door. Elisabeth understood his gesture. They would leave. They wouldn't endanger this woman and her son any longer. She shook her head firmly and pointed at the wounded man. He couldn't be moved. Not yet. Not safely. The two Americans looked at each other again. They were trapped here as surely as if they'd been captured. Elisabeth began preparing the food. She cut the small piece of pork into smaller pieces. 5 people instead of 2. She boiled the potatoes. She sliced the bread thin. It wasn't much. It was what she had. While she cooked, Hermann moved closer to the Americans. He looked at their uniforms. Their gear. Their weapons. One of them noticed him watching and smiled slightly. A tired smile. The smile of someone who hadn't smiled in weeks. Hermann didn't smile back. He just looked. The smell of cooking food filled the cabin. Outside, night had fallen completely. Stars were visible through the small window. The forest was dark and cold and full of men trying to kill each other. Inside, warmth. Food. Temporary safety. Elisabeth was setting plates on the table when they heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots and snow. Multiple men. Hermann froze. The 2 American soldiers grabbed their rifles and moved toward the door. Elisabeth held up her hand. Wait. The door burst open. 4 men entered. German soldiers. Wehrmacht infantry. One had a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another carried a light machine gun. The third and fourth were supporting each other. Both were wounded. One had a bandage around his head, blood seeping through. The other was limping badly, his left leg dragging. The lead German soldier saw the Americans immediately. He unslung his rifle. The Americans raised theirs. For 3 seconds nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The cabin was silent except for the crackling of the wood stove. Elisabeth stepped between them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply said in German, "Nicht hier. Nicht hut." Not here. Not today. The German soldier stared at her. He was young. Maybe 20. His face was covered in dirt and frost. His eyes were hollow. He looked at the Americans. He looked at his wounded companions. He looked at Elisabeth. She held his gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't move. The German soldier lowered his rifle slowly. He said something to his companions. They moved inside cautiously. The 2 wounded Germans were lowered to the floor on the opposite side of the cabin from the wounded American. The Americans still had their rifles raised. The Germans were disarmed now practically. Too exhausted to fight. Too hungry to care. Elisabeth moved between the 2 groups like a referee in a deadly match. She gestured toward the table. She gestured toward the floor where the wounded men lay. She began speaking in German, translating as best she could into simple words and gestures for the Americans. This was Christmas Eve. This was her home. In this cabin on this night, there would be no killing. Anyone who wanted to fight could leave. Anyone who stayed would eat and rest and tend their wounds in peace. The German soldier who had entered first looked at the Americans. The Americans looked back. Neither group lowered their weapons completely. But neither group left. They were all trapped. Trapped by wounds and exhaustion and the simple human need for warmth and food. Elisabeth continued cooking. She now had 9 people to feed with food for 2. She cut the portions smaller. She boiled more potatoes. She made the single loaf of bread stretch impossibly thin. Hermann helped her, moving carefully between the Germans and Americans, neither group quite trusting this arrangement but neither willing to break it. The German soldier who had been carrying the machine gun set it down and moved to help his wounded companions. The man with the head wound was barely conscious. The man with the leg injury was trying not to scream. The German soldier began unwrapping the leg wound. Shrapnel had torn through the calf muscle. The wound was infected. Yellow pus mixed with blood. The German soldier cleaned it as best he could with snow from outside and strips torn from his own undershirt. He had no proper medical supplies. Nothing to prevent infection. Nothing to ease pain. Elisabeth moved to help. She brought her limited medical supplies to the wounded German soldiers. She cleaned the head wound first. Scalp injury. Looked worse than it was. She wrapped fresh bandages. Then she moved to the leg wound. Worse than it looked. Infection spreading. She cleaned it with iodine. The German soldier screamed and passed out. Better that way. She couldn't do much more. The wound needed antibiotics she didn't have. Surgery she couldn't perform. Time she couldn't guarantee. While she worked on the Germans, the healthy American soldiers watched. They had been enemies 5 minutes ago. Now they were watching a German woman save German soldiers while a wounded American lay unconscious near a wood stove. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Or maybe the simple humanity of it was overwhelming. One of the Americans lowered his rifle completely. The other followed a moment later. By the time Elisabeth finished with the wounded Germans, the food was ready. She served it on mismatched plates. Tiny portions. A few pieces of potato. A sliver of pork. A thin slice of bread. She served the Germans first, then the Americans. The wounded men were given water. The healthy men ate in silence. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They were enemies. They had been killing each other for months. Tomorrow they would try to kill each other again. Tonight they were sharing Christmas Eve dinner in a hunting lodge in the middle of a frozen forest. Hermann sat beside his mother and ate his portion slowly. He watched the German soldiers eat. He watched the Americans eat. They ate the same way. Carefully. Grateful. Exhausted. They looked the same too, under the dirt and frost and blood. Young men. Scared men. Men who wanted to survive this war and go home. After dinner, Elisabeth cleared the plates. The healthy soldiers helped her. Germans and Americans working side by side to clean dishes. The absurdity continued. The humanity continued. The wounded men slept or pretended to sleep. The healthy men took turns watching the door, though what they were watching for was unclear. More soldiers? Rescue? Elisabeth found extra blankets and distributed them. Not enough to go around. Some men shared. A German soldier shared a blanket with an American. Neither seemed to notice or care. They were cold. The blanket was warm. That was all that mattered. Hermann climbed into the loft where he slept. He looked down at the scene below. 6 soldiers lying on the floor of their cabin. 3 Germans. 3 Americans. Enemies. Tonight just men. Just people trying not to die. Elisabeth sat beside the wood stove and opened her Bible. She read the Christmas story aloud in German. The American soldiers didn't understand the words. They understood the gesture. The German soldiers listened with their eyes closed. One of them began crying silently. She finished reading and closed the Bible. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled. Outside, the forest was completely silent. No artillery. No gunfire. Christmas Eve. Even war paused for Christmas Eve. Around midnight, one of the American soldiers began humming. Quietly. A Christmas carol. Elisabeth recognized the tune. Silent Night. She began singing in German. Still nacked. One of the German soldiers joined her. Then another. The Americans hummed along, not knowing the German words but knowing the melody. For 3 minutes, enemies sang together in a cabin in the woods. When the song ended, they returned to silence. The kind of silence that holds more than sound. The wounded American woke briefly, looked around in confusion, then fell back asleep. The German with the head wound slept deeply. The German with the leg wound moaned occasionally but didn't wake. The healthy soldiers took shifts sleeping. 2 men always awake. 1 German. 1 American. Watching each other. Watching the door. Watching over the wounded. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold. Elisabeth woke first and started the fire. The soldiers stirred. They looked at each other in the weak morning light and seemed surprised that they were all still alive. That nobody had tried to kill anyone during the night. That this impossible truce had held. Elisabeth prepared a small breakfast. The last of the bread. Some water boiled with a few leaves for tea. She served it the same way she had served dinner. Small portions. Distributed fairly. Germans and Americans eating together. After breakfast, the soldiers began preparing to leave. They had survived the night. Now they needed to return to their units. To the war. To killing each other. The wounded American could walk with support. The German with the head wound was stable. The German with the leg wound was worse. The infection had spread overnight. He had a fever. He couldn't walk. The other German soldiers fashioned a crude stretcher from blankets and branches. They would carry him. The Americans prepared to leave first. They gathered their equipment. Checked their weapons. One of them approached Elisabeth and spoke in English. She didn't understand the words but understood the meaning. Thank you. She nodded. The American reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar. Army ration. He offered it to Hermann. The boy looked at his mother. She nodded. Hermann took the chocolate. The Americans left through the front door, carrying their wounded companion between them. They headed west toward American lines. They didn't look back. The German soldiers watched them go. Nobody raised a weapon. Nobody took a shot. The Americans disappeared into the trees. For a moment they had existed outside the war. Now they were back in it. The Germans prepared to leave next. They lifted their wounded companion on the makeshift stretcher. It took 3 men to carry him. The fourth, the young soldier who had lowered his rifle the night before, paused at the door. He looked at Elisabeth. He said something in German. She nodded. He left. The Germans headed east toward German lines. Elisabeth and Hermann watched from the window until they vanished into the forest. Then they were alone again. The cabin was empty except for bloodstains on the floor and 9 sets of footprints in the snow outside. Evidence of what had happened. Evidence of something impossible. Elisabeth cleaned the bloodstains with cold water and snow. She washed the dishes. She returned the cabin to its previous state as if nothing had occurred. As if she hadn't spent Christmas Eve feeding enemies and preventing a slaughter. Hermann asked her why she had done it. Why she had let the Americans stay. Why she had stopped the Germans from shooting. Why she had risked their lives for soldiers who would return to killing each other the next day. Elisabeth looked at her son for a long moment. Then she said it was Christmas Eve. That was the only explanation she offered. It was Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve you don't kill. You don't let others kill. Not in your home. Not if you can prevent it. Fritz Vincken returned to the cabin 3 days after Christmas. The Allied offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was in full force. His artillery battery had been firing constantly. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in 3 days. He found his wife and son alive and well. He asked if anything had happened during Christmas. Elisabeth told him they had visitors. She didn't provide details. He didn't ask for them. They both understood that some stories were better left unexamined during wartime. The war continued. The Battle of the Bulge raged through January. Thousands more men died in the Hürtgen Forest. American and German forces continued killing each other with industrial efficiency. The front lines shifted back and forth. Villages were destroyed. Forests were leveled. The hunting cabin survived untouched in the middle of it all. In late January, Allied forces finally pushed the Germans back permanently. The Hürtgen Forest fell under American control. Fritz Vincken was captured during the retreat. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Belgium. He survived. Elisabeth and Hermann evacuated the cabin and moved to relatives in Bavaria. They survived. The war ended 4 months later. For decades, Elisabeth told no one about Christmas Eve 1944. Fritz knew something had happened but never pressed for details. Hermann remembered but didn't speak of it. What would he say? That his mother had saved American and German soldiers in the same night? That she had prevented a firefight in their cabin? That enemies had shared Christmas dinner? Who would believe it? The story seemed too unlikely even to the people who had lived it. But in 1996, 52 years after that Christmas Eve, Hermann Vincken decided the story should be recorded before it was lost. He was 64 years old and living in Hawaii. His mother had died in 1983. His father had died in 1992. He was the last person alive who had been in that cabin on December 24, 1944. He wrote down everything he remembered. The details. The tension. The fear. The impossible cooperation. He tried to find the soldiers who had been there. He searched American military records for soldiers wounded in the Hürtgen Forest on December 23 or 24, 1944. He found thousands of names. He searched German records for infantry units in that sector at that time. He found hundreds of units. He couldn't narrow it down. Too much time had passed. Too many men had died. Too many records were incomplete or lost. But he kept searching. In 1997, he was contacted by an American veteran who had read about his search in a military history newsletter. The veteran said he had been in the Hürtgen Forest on Christmas Eve 1944. He had been wounded. He and 2 companions had stumbled upon a cabin where a German woman and her son had sheltered them. 3 German soldiers had arrived later. There had been no fighting. They had shared a meal. They had survived the night. The veteran couldn't remember the exact location of the cabin. The forest had been destroyed by artillery. Everything looked different after the war. But he remembered the night. He remembered the German woman who had saved his life. He remembered the impossibility of it. Hermann and the veteran met in 1998. They were both old men by then. They sat together and compared memories. The details matched. The same cabin. The same night. The same impossible truce. They confirmed what had seemed too unlikely to be true. For one night, in the middle of the worst battle of the Western Front, enemies had chosen not to kill each other. They had chosen to survive together instead. The veteran's name was Ralph Blank. He had been a 19-year-old private in December 1944. He had been shot in the abdomen on December 23 during a German counterattack. His 2 companions had dragged him through the forest trying to find American lines. They had gotten lost. They had stumbled upon the cabin by accident. By miracle. By whatever force guides desperate men through frozen forests on Christmas Eve. Ralph Blank remembered Elisabeth Vincken as the woman who saved his life. He remembered her refusing to let German soldiers shoot Americans in her home. He remembered her distributing food equally between enemies. He remembered sleeping on the floor of that cabin, too exhausted to care about the German soldiers sleeping 3 feet away. He remembered waking up on Christmas morning surprised to still be alive. He had never found out what happened to the German woman and her son. He had never learned their names. He had carried the memory of that night for 53 years without being able to thank the person who made it possible. Hermann and Ralph spent 2 days together talking about that night. They filled in details each had forgotten or never knew. Ralph described what his journey to the cabin had been like. The cold, the fear, the certainty that he was dying. Hermann described what it was like to watch his mother make peace between soldiers who wanted to kill each other. They agreed on the essential facts. One woman had prevented a massacre through sheer force of will. She had imposed humanity on a situation designed to eliminate it. She had made men remember they were men before they were soldiers. Ralph Blank died in 2001. Hermann Vincken died in 2008. Both men spent their final years telling the story of Christmas Eve 1944, trying to ensure it wouldn't be forgotten. They gave interviews to historians. They spoke at schools. They appeared in documentaries about World War II. The story spread slowly, mostly among military history enthusiasts and people interested in unusual war stories. It never achieved widespread recognition. No books were written about it. No movies were made. Just a few articles. A few oral history interviews. Enough to preserve the memory but not enough to make it famous. The hunting cabin doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down sometime in the 1960s. The clearing where it stood has been reclaimed by the forest. There's no marker. No memorial. No indication that anything significant happened there. The Hürtgen Forest is quiet now. Trees have grown back where artillery shells once destroyed everything. Hiking trails wind through areas where men died by the thousands. Battle sites have become parking lots. Pillboxes have been converted to historical exhibits. The forest has healed on the surface. The scars remain underneath. Historians who have studied the story of Christmas Eve 1944 note several elements that made it possible. First, Elisabeth Vincken's personality. She was a strong-willed woman who had survived years of war. She was not easily intimidated. Second, the timing. Christmas Eve carried symbolic weight even for soldiers who had been killing each other for years. Third, exhaustion. The soldiers on both sides were too tired to fight. They had been in combat for weeks. They had seen friends die. They were cold, hungry, and traumatized. The prospect of a warm cabin and hot food outweighed the prospect of continuing to fight. But these explanations only account for why the truce was possible. They don't explain why it happened. Why those particular soldiers, in that particular cabin, on that particular night, chose humanity over hatred. Why a German woman risked her life and her son's life for enemy soldiers. Why German and American soldiers agreed to an arrangement that violated every principle of military conduct they had been taught. Why nobody fired a shot when it would have been so easy to fire. So expected to fire. So justified to fire. The story challenges comfortable narratives about World War II. It suggests that even in a war defined by clear moral distinctions between good and evil, individual moments existed outside those categories. The German soldiers in that cabin were Wehrmacht infantry fighting for a regime that had committed unparalleled atrocities. The American soldiers were liberators fighting to end Nazi Germany. But on Christmas Eve 1944 they were just men. Cold, wounded, scared men who wanted to survive the night. Elisabeth Vincken didn't save American soldiers because she opposed the Nazi regime. She didn't shelter German soldiers because she supported it. She fed hungry men because they were hungry. She treated wounded men because they were wounded. She stopped violence because violence could be stopped. Her actions weren't political or ideological. They were human. Simply irreducibly human. And in choosing humanity over ideology, she created a space where enemies could exist together without killing each other. That space lasted less than 12 hours. By morning the soldiers returned to the war. They returned to their units. They returned to following orders and shooting at each other. Some of them probably died before the war ended. Some of them probably killed other soldiers before the war ended. The truce in the cabin didn't stop the war. It didn't change the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. It didn't prevent future atrocities. It was just one night. One small moment of mercy in a war that killed 60 million people. But it happened. That's what matters. In the middle of the worst battle of the Western Front, on the coldest day of winter, in a forest where men were dying by the hundreds every day, it happened. A German woman stopped a massacre. German and American soldiers ate dinner together. Enemies slept side by side. Nobody died. Everyone lived. For one night war paused. Not because generals declared a ceasefire. Not because politicians negotiated a truce. Because one woman said, "Not here, not today," and meant it. The men in that cabin expected death. They found mercy instead. Mercy offered by a woman who had every reason to turn them away. Mercy accepted by soldiers who had every reason to refuse it. Mercy that existed without explanation or justification, simply because one person decided it should exist. Wars are full of stories about killing. About sacrifice and heroism and necessary violence. This is a story about not killing. About unnecessary peace. About choosing to stop when continuing would have been easier. It's a smaller story than most war stories. Quieter. Less dramatic. 9 people survived a night they shouldn't have survived. That's all. But sometimes the smallest stories carry the most weight because they reveal what's possible when people choose to be human before they choose to be anything else. The cabin is gone. The soldiers are dead. The war ended 79 years ago. But the choice Elisabeth Vincken made on Christmas Eve 1944 remains. It remains in the memory of the men who survived that night. It remains in the story Hermann Vincken told before he died. It remains as evidence that even in the darkest moments, mercy is possible. That even when everything argues for violence, peace can emerge. That even when war demands death, life can persist. They expected death. They found mercy. In a cabin in the woods. On Christmas Eve. While a war raged around them and would rage for months more. While thousands died in the same forest where 9 men survived. They found mercy because one woman believed mercy was still possible. Because soldiers on both sides were desperate enough to accept it. Because for 12 hours humanity mattered more than nationality. Because for one night the war lost. And 64 years later, 2 old men sat together and confirmed that it had happened. That it was real. That mercy had existed when nothing suggested it could. That they had lived through something impossible and survived to tell about it. That's the legacy. Not victory or defeat. Not heroism or cowardice. Just the simple, profound truth that even in the middle of hell, people can choose not to be demons. The cabin is gone but the choice remains. And the question remains. If it was possible then, in that place, under those circumstances, what else is possible? What other mercies wait to be discovered? What other moments of humanity are we capable of even when everything argues against them? The men in that cabin didn't answer those questions. They just lived them. For one night. That was enough.